Hello, everybody. My name is Lisa Mangilia. I'm the Executive Director at the History of Diving Museum, and we welcome you to our March 2022 Immerse Yourself evening. Tonight, we have with us Chet Van Duzer. He's a board member for the Lazarus Project at the University of Rochester. And before we get into that, I want to thank Silent World of Key Largo for being our Immerse Yourself sponsor tonight. They're a dive center up in Key Largo and have been partners and friends of the museum for quite some time. So thank you, Silent World, for sponsoring us this evening. I'm excited because our topic, which is sea monsters on medieval and Renaissance maps. Chet Van Duzer is the author, and we actually have this in the museum store if anybody's interested in picking this up, but it complements our dive into art fantasy. For those of you that can see my background, I'm sitting in our exhibit in the portion that talks about sea monsters and some of those early legends, and we've got some beautiful work from the Art Guild. And if you get a chance and you're in the Keys, come on down to the History of Diving Museum. This exhibit will be open till April 20th. And we'll also be recording again tonight and putting it on YouTube. But we encourage you to stop by, or at least check out our link that has a little bit of a highlight, and you can get a portion, a little tease of the exhibit on our YouTube channel. So with all that being said, Chet, thank you for taking the time in your busy travel day and being with us tonight. And I'm going to hand over the evening to you.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Sea monsters are a fun subject, as I was telling Lisa just before we went live. Researching this book was a lot of fun. Writing it was a lot of fun. And it's been a lot of fun seeing people react to it and be interested in the monsters. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. There we are. And we will dive right in. Let's see. There we go. So here we have a classic image of a sea monster attacking a ship from Olaus Magnus's Carta Marina of 1539. We'll come back to this image later. But I want to begin by saying that sea monsters on maps might seem like a frivolous subject at first, but it's important not only in the history of cartography and the history of art, but also in the history of the representation of sea creatures. So there's a natural history element to the subject that's important. Before we get into the monsters themselves, monsters on maps themselves, we'll go through some preliminary matters, some thoughts about the definition of sea monster, a medieval theory that generated many sea monsters, a story about whales that appears on several maps, and then we'll look at the different types of medieval maps as a background to what will follow. So what is a sea monster? So the word monster is notoriously difficult to define. For many medieval and Renaissance authors, a monster was something somehow against nature. But for St. Augustine and Isidore of Seville, a monster was something that was part of God's plan and that teaches about the dangers of sin. For Thomas of Cantimpré, a medieval encyclopedist, large size and rarity are some of the defining characteristics of sea monsters. I would suggest that strangeness and the inducement of discomfort or fear are also important characteristics of a sea monster. But it's important to note that the definition of monster changes over time, and that's another interesting aspect of the subject. So here we see a spectacular picture of a man with a whale. And for us, of course, a whale is not a monster at all. It's a beautiful, intelligent creature that's to be preserved. But to medieval and the people of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, a whale was indeed a monster. And is a walrus a monster? Again, we would say no, but here we have an image of a walrus on a map from 1595, where the walrus is explicitly identified as a monster. So again, the definitions of monsters change over time, and the creatures that a certain people define as a monster says a lot about them. So now we'll dive into the theory I mentioned that generated many sea monsters that we'll see on maps. So there was a belief that started in classical antiquity and continued through the Middle Ages, even into the 17th century, that held that for every land creature, there's a corresponding sea creature. So if there's a lion on land, there has to be an aquatic lion in the sea. And this is not a sea lion in our sense of the word, but it's a lion with fishy hindquarters. And here we have a Roman mosaic of an aquatic goat illustrating this theory that for every land creature, there was a corresponding sea creature. And even an aquatic eagle. So we can see this was a thoroughgoing theory of this correspondence between land and sea creatures. And I'll briefly mention the story of the whale in the Physiologus and medieval bestiaries. And according to this story, the Physiologus was written in the 3rd or 4th century, and it tells the story of sailors sailing at sea, and they encounter an island, or what they believe to be an island, and they land on it and start a fire. But it turns out what they thought was an island was actually a whale, and the whale feels the fire and dives down into the ocean, taking the men and the kettle and fire with him. And the moral of the story, because stories in the Physiologus are moralized, is that if you put your faith in the devil, in this case likening the whale island to the devil, you'll be carried down to hell. So this story again appeared in the Physiologus, and then it was copied from the Physiologus into medieval bestiaries or medieval animal books, and we see an illustrated an image of that scene in this psalter from the 14th century. So the ship approaching what they think is an island and men lighting a fire on its back. Here we see a more elaborate image of this scene. Here we can see there's a tree or shrub growing from the whale's head, and this is part of what deceived the men into thinking it was an island. Another elaborate image of the scene. Here we have some flowers growing on the whale's back. Again, this is part of what convinced them that it was an island. This really wonderful image of lighting a fire on a whale's back from a 14th century bestiary by Brunetto Latini, an Italian author. And here we get some sense of the size of the whale. And again, at the top, we see a tree that is part of 2 trees, actually, that are part of what deceived the men into thinking that this was an island. So moving on to the main types of medieval maps, we have mappae mundi, or world maps. We have nautical charts, which were tools for navigation, and third, manuscripts of Ptolemy's geography. So I'll just give a very brief introduction to these. So to show what a mappa mundi is, I'm going to start with this modern map of the world. I'm going to crop it to only show Europe, Africa, and Asia, because those were the parts of the world known in antiquity in the Middle Ages. And then rotate it so that East is at the top, because that's the orientation of medieval mappa mundi. East is placed at the top because that's where paradise was thought to be located. That was where the sun rose. It was the holy direction. And then we put next to that a 15th century mappa mundi. And this mappa mundi is very typical in its simplicity and schematic nature. And as we can see by comparing the 2 maps, the mappa mundi is not at all intended to help one get from point A to point B. It's really a simple geography lesson. It indicates the relative sizes and positions of the 3 parts of the world, Asia, Europe, and Africa. And this type of map has been called a TO map since the 15th century, as we can see from the text here. And it's called that because of its structure. So we have the O of the surrounding ocean, which is blue in this image. And then we have the T of the three bodies of water that separate the continents. So we have the Tanis River that separates Asia from Europe, the Mediterranean that separates Europe from Africa, and the Nile was held to separate Africa from Asia, which is not really very accurate, but that's what people believe. So the vast numerical majority of medieval mappamundi are very similar to this one in that they show very little geographical detail and have very little artistic elaboration. It is not these maps that have sea monsters. There are more elaborate mappamundi like this one. So this one we see has many place names. It has an image of a mountain. It shows some rivers. It's larger to have room for this additional information. We see paradise in the east at the top of the map. And then you have still more elaborate and larger mappamundi like this one, which show more geographical detail, are more artistically elaborate. And it's this type of mappamundi, these large elaborate ones, that contain images of sea monsters. We'll return to this map later. I just want to briefly mention another type of map, which is called a zonal mappamundi. These, instead of being oriented with east at the top, have north at the top, so are a little bit more familiar in that respect. The idea of these maps is very simple. It's cold near the poles, it's hot near the equator, and in between it's temperate, which is true. It's a simple fact, but in these maps, that fact is exaggerated. So the cold zone is held to be uninhabitably cold, and the torrid zone is held to be uninhabitably hot. And in fact, so hot that you couldn't even cross it in a ship. And here we see that there's a hypothetical southern continent south of the equator that mirrors the conditions in the northern hemisphere. Moving on to nautical charts, which are practical tools for navigation in their foundation. So I'll begin again with a modern map that shows the part of the world illustrated, depicted in a typical medieval nautical chart, which is to say the Mediterranean basin, Europe, North Africa, the Holy Land in the east, and a little bit of Scandinavia in the north. I'm going to switch now to a nautical chart that shows exactly the same portion of the world here. I've indicated the Iberian Peninsula here. The Red Sea is helpfully indicated in red. We can see the boot of Italy in the center of the map. This green feature in North Africa is the Atlas mountain chain. And this colorful feature here north of Italy is a depiction of the Alps. If we zoom in, we can see a couple of the distinctive characteristics of nautical charts. First, the dense place names along the coasts, which are written perpendicular to the coasts. In a map that's used for navigation, it's the coasts that are of the greatest interest. And yes, let me just say that this is a very elaborately decorated nautical chart with these huge images here of Genoa, Venice, and this depiction of the Alps that I mentioned before. This type of chart would not have been taken to sea. With this level of artistic decoration, it was something for collection and display by nobles and royalty, not for practical navigation. This is more like a chart that would have been taken to the sea, very little in the way of decoration. So ironically, the nautical charts that were elaborately enough decorated to include sea monsters would not be the ones that were taken to sea. And finally, maps in manuscripts of Ptolemy's geography. So Ptolemy was a Greek geographer working in Alexandria, Egypt in the 2nd century AD. And he created his geography in the 2nd century AD. And we don't see one of his world maps every day. So just to orient ourselves, here's Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Indian Ocean. And if we zoom in on the Ptolemaic map of the Iberian Peninsula, we can see that it's very different from a nautical chart in the density of the information in the interior. So there's plenty of information on the coasts, but there's not the same emphasis on the coast. Here, there's dense geographical information everywhere. And if we look at the margins of the map, we can see that space is oriented by latitude and longitude. So we have scales of latitude and longitude in the margins of the map. And just to have a look at one other Ptolemaic local map, this is Ptolemy's map of Italy. Again, we see the dense geographical information in the interior and the scale of latitude and longitude in the margin. So Ptolemy organized space through this mathematical grid. Moving on to sea monsters on maps at last, after that long preamble, we'll return to that 10th century map we saw earlier. And if we look at the top of the map, we have this image of Adam and Eve and the serpent in paradise. So this is again showing that east is at the top of the map. If we zoom in on the Eastern Ocean, we have here some sea monsters, and in particular, a marine chicken or an aquatic chicken. And this is exactly the type of hybrid creature I mentioned before. So you have the chicken on land, familiar terrestrial chicken. People believed that there had to be a marine chicken as well. And looking at the lower part of the map, which is to say the western part of the map, we zoom in. The map's damaged a little bit, so it's not easy to see the image, but we have here a man inside a sea monster. So here's the head of the sea monster on the left, and his tail stretching all the way over here on the right. Here's the man. You can see that he's holding his hand to his mouth. When we think about a person inside a sea monster, particularly in the Middle Ages, this can only be Jonah. And we're to understand his gesture of holding his hand to his mouth as Jonah praying for deliverance from the sea monster. As dramatic as this image is, illustrating Jonah inside the sea monster, it's actually quite rare. It's much more common to represent Jonah either being swallowed by the sea monster or emerging from the sea monster's mouth. So in this pulpit in Ravello, Italy from the 13th century, on the right, we have Jonah being swallowed by the sea monster. On the left, Jonah emerging from the sea monster. Just to zoom in on Jonah happily emerging from the sea monster. Here's another image of Jonah emerging from the sea monster. In this case, the sea monster is rather more whale-like. We see the blowhole on the top of its head. So the image of Jonah inside the sea monster is rare, but it's not without precedent. So here we have Jonah inside the sea monster in a 9th century Psalter. Again, we see that he has his hands in front of his mouth, so we're to understand that he's again praying for his deliverance. But although it's not without its precedent, the image on the 10th century map we were looking at is unusual, of Jonah inside the sea monster. Here we have a really striking image, a 12th century zonal mappa mundi surrounded by sea monsters. So here we have the zonal map in the center, and the red there is the torrid zone at the equator. And then we have the temperate zones, and then at the two poles, the frigid zones. But for our purposes, the important thing is that circle is a representation of the world. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see that the whole world is surrounded by this enormous sea monster, which is swallowing its own tail. And this is to be understood as a representation of the biblical Leviathan. And then even outside of that sea monster, in the circumfluent ocean, there are 4 more enormous sea monsters with sort of human heads, and 2 of them have 4 limbs, and the other 2 do not have 4 limbs. So there's a little bit of variety in those sea monsters. But to me, the really striking thing here is how puny the Earth seems in comparison to these enormous sea monsters. It really seems that sea monsters could do whatever they wanted with the world. This is the 12th century painted ceiling in the Church of St. Martin in Zillis, Switzerland. If you're ever in that area, I highly recommend a visit. It's really very impressive in person. Initially, this does not look like a map, but it has some really interesting features that essentially turn it into a map. So in the four corners of this huge composition, there are angels with trumpets. And this is alluding to a passage in Revelation about the angels in the corners of the world. And then all around the composition, we have water. And this represents the O of the circumfluent ocean that we saw in Mappamundis. So it's not a geographical image of the world, but it is an image of the world. In this case, the world is a stage for the playing out of Christian history, specifically the history of Saint Martin and the history of Jesus. And that watery circumference of this ceiling is populated by sea monsters. So here we have an aquatic stag, so the marine equivalent of a male deer, being bitten by something that looks like an aquatic lion. It's really hard to be sure. Here we have an aquatic lion eating an aquatic chicken, so another appearance of the aquatic chicken. And here we have a sea elephant, which is probably intended to represent a walrus, but is a really striking and charming image. So in this case, the whole circumference, the whole circumfluent ocean is populated by these really impressive sea monsters. And so I think the artist is alluding to the wildness of the edges of the earth. We look at sea monsters on nautical charts. Here we have the western part of a nautical chart made by the Pizzigani brothers, two Italian brothers, in 1367. Just to orient ourselves, we can see Ireland and the Iberian Peninsula, and the area of interest is in between them out in the Atlantic. If we zoom in on them, we can see that here there's a giant octopus attacking a ship. And then here there's a flying dragon carrying away one of the sailors. And the texts that you see there explain that that's what we're seeing. And if you look closely at the giant octopus, it's actually pulling one of the sailors off the ship. I haven't been able to find the source of the flying dragon carrying away this sailor, but I think I did find the source of the image of the giant octopus attacking the ship. So this is Thomas of Cantimpre's illustrated encyclopedia from the 15th century. And in his chapter on the polyp or octopus, he says that the octopus is strong enough to pull a sailor from a ship, and that's what he illustrates, even though that doesn't look very much like an octopus. Clearly, the artist had never seen an octopus, but this idea that an octopus could pull a sailor from a ship was probably from this encyclopedia. And this is a great case of instance of a pattern, which is that as fantastic as some of the sea monsters on medieval and Renaissance maps seem, we might think that they were invented in the moment by the cartographer, but many of them were actually borrowed from sources that the cartographer would have thought reliable, like an illustrated encyclopedia. Moving on to the so-called Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most elaborately decorated maps to have survived from the Middle Ages. It's called the Catalan Atlas because it's written in Catalan, the language of Catalonia. And I've highlighted here the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean at the bottom. If we zoom in on the Indian Ocean, we can see that there's a beautiful siren there. We'll see, of course, the Indian Ocean was the part of the world furthest from Europe that was known at the time. And the furthest reaches of the world tend to be populated with monsters in our imaginations. So we'll see that the Indian Ocean is a frequent locus of sea monsters. Going to the Persian Gulf, The text says, "In the Indian Ocean there are fishermen and very rich islands. The fishermen who dive in the sea say their spells before descending to make the fish flee. If by chance the fishermen dive without having said their spells, the fish eat them." So looking at the image, we see two men collecting what seem to be these colored stones. These are intended to represent pearls. So these are pearl divers. And the text is explaining that the pearl divers have spells, they say, to scare away the sea monsters before they go diving. So we can see that the two sea monsters are swimming away from them. So this is one of the few cases in which humans have a way to protect themselves from sea monsters. This is Mathia de Villadesta's spectacular nautical chart of 1413. Takes a moment to orient oneself, but here's the boot of Italy in the center, the British Isles here, and then out in the Atlantic, in the North Atlantic, we have a scene of whaling. And again, just showing the position of this image and text about whaling. I'm now going to rotate it so that we can have a better look at it. Here it is. It's a curious image because the anchor of the ship is reaching down to the tail of the whale. Fortunately, there's some text below that sheds a little bit of light on this strange scene. It says, it falls into two parts. It says, "This sea is called the ocean sea, and therein are found great fish, which sailors take to be small islands, and take up their quarters on these fish. And the sailors land on these islands and make fires, and cause such heat that the fish feels it and sets itself in motion. And they have no time to get on board and are lost." And then the second part, "And those who know this land on the said fish, and there make thongs of its back, and make fast the head of the ship's anchor. And in this way they flay the skin off it, whereof they make ropes for their ships, and of the skin are made good coverings for haystacks." So the first part of this is very clearly the myth I mentioned earlier that comes from the Physiologus of the sailors who land on what they think to be an island, but it turns out to be a whale. The second part is completely different. It talks about the very practical use that can be made of the skin of a whale. So it's clear that the cartographer was combining information from different sources. And it's also clear that he had never had any experience with whales or whaling or anything like that. This is the so-called Genoese world map of 1457. People have said that it was made in Genoa, but without actually any good evidence for that. Just to orient ourselves, here's the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean. And if we zoom in on the Indian Ocean, we can see that there are 4 sea monsters there. There are no sea monsters in other parts of the map. So this is another case that shows that the Indian Ocean was commonly a locus for sea monsters. And looking at each of these individually now, first we have the sea pig, so an aquatic pig, another case of this theory about there being a correspondence between land and sea creatures. Another siren, this one with a single tail. The Sera, so-called from its serrated crest. If you look at the top of its crest here, you can see the serrations. And the text beneath says, Pliny, the Roman encyclopedist, describes this Sera, asserting that with its saw-like crest, it often breaks the ships of the natives of India with a single attack. But when its crest becomes stuck in the wood of the ship and it is unable to escape, it kills itself. And then we have this spectacular demon-like creature. So it has the horns on its head. It has these membranes that join its arms to its torso and its fishy tail. And if ever a sea monster on a map looked like it had been invented in the moment by the cartographer, it's this one. However, this sea monster was copied from a source that the cartographer would have thought trustworthy. So the text says that it emerged from the sea and attacked some cows pasturing by the seashore. It was captured and brought to Venice, and it was mounted and carried about to many parts of the country. So what is the source of this image? Well, here on the right, we have a sea monster illustrating a passage from Poggio Bracciolini's Facetiae, which was written between 1438 and 1452, which is to say a few years before the map. And the sea monsters aren't exactly identical, but they're very, very similar. So the one on the right has two tails. The membranes don't exactly join its arms to its torso, but it does have the two horns in its head. And the texts in Poggio Bracciolini and the text on the map are very, very similar. They say very similar things about the two monsters. So we really can't doubt that Poggio Bracciolini was the source. And again, this is a great illustration of the fact that that the sea monsters on medieval maps, as imaginative as they may seem at first glance, often come from sources that the cartographers would have thought trustworthy. This is the Catalanistense world map of about 1460, so called because it's in the Catalan language and it's in the Estense library. And just to orient ourselves, here's Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Indian Ocean. And once again, the only place where we have sea monsters on this map is in the Indian Ocean. Right here, we zoom in, we can see that there are three different kinds of sirens. And the text below explains that the one on the top is half woman, half fish. The one in the middle is half woman, half bird. And the one at the bottom is half woman, half horse, which is an unusual type of siren. If we zoom in, we can see an interesting feature of the painting of these sea monsters on this map. You can see there's sort of a rectangular border here. And what happened is that one artist was painting these wavy lines on the map to indicate the ocean, which was a very boring job. And this was certainly a lower paid artist. And he left a blank spot, a blank rectangle, where another artist came in and painted the sea monster. So a more skilled artist came in and painted the sea monster. So we have evidence here of a sea monster specialist for the painting of maps. Moving on to sea monsters in Ptolemy's geography. This is the manuscript of Ptolemy's geography in the National Library of Spain in Madrid, which was made in about 1460. And I made a trip to Spain to examine this manuscript, among others. And I'd read about the manuscript and hadn't seen any mention of sea monsters, but I opened it up and there were the sea monsters, many, many sea monsters in the oceans in this manuscript. In fact, I have not encountered another manuscript that has this same number of sea monsters in it, which is to say so many sea monsters. And if we zoom in, we can see that they are of all different types. So here at the top, we have a siren, and below we have these two sea monsters, which seem to be mostly toothy mouths. These to me do seem to be invented creatures. Moving on to another map in the same manuscript, we can see that we have another type of siren here at the top, and a different siren in European clothes at the lower right, so with two tails now, as opposed to one up above. And here at the left, we have an aquatic dog. So another of these hybrid creatures. So we have the terrestrial dog, and so we have the aquatic dog. And just to show another example, here in the center below, we have another case of an aquatic pig. And then up above, we have a really very appealing aquatic rabbit. So again, there are more sea monsters on the maps in this manuscript than I have found in any other manuscript. It's really very impressive. So having a quick look at the transition from medieval sea monsters to those of the Renaissance, I'm going to look at two maps by the same cartographer that were made just 9 years apart. So this is Martin Waldseemüller's famous world map of 1507, famous for being the first to apply the name America to the New World. And it has a few references to sea monsters in the Indian Ocean. There are no illustrations, just text, and it says the sort of thing we might expect in medieval texts about sea monsters. They fight a lot, they're dangerous, and so by implication, they make the ocean a dangerous place. Just to show those texts about sea monsters in the Indian Ocean. This is Martin Waldseemüller's Carta Marina of 1516. So another world map made by the same man 9 years later. And we have this image of a sea monster south of Africa. And we'll zoom in on it. And first of all, we can see that it's an artistically sophisticated image. It's showing 3 dimensions. It's dynamic. The monster is in motion. And also importantly, it's artistically, it's of the Renaissance, but also philosophically, it's of the Renaissance. So in Waldseemüller's earlier map, he showed the ocean as a place of danger with respect to sea monsters. But here we have King Manuel of Portugal controlling this sea monster. And symbolically, this indicates Portugal's control of the sea route from Europe around Africa to Asia. So while on Waldseemüller's earlier map, the sea is depicted as a place of danger, here, just 9 years later, the same cartographer depicts the ocean as a space of opportunity that can be controlled by humans. So it's a really remarkable change in the course of just 9 years. This is Olaus Magnus's Carta Marina of 1539. I'm showing the 1572 edition because this copy is beautifully hand-colored. These sea monsters are some of the most famous and influential of the Renaissance. So if we zoom in here, we can see that the Northern Ocean, that's Scandinavia on the right and Iceland in the upper left, is just full of sea monsters. It's really very impressive. And Olaus Magnus published a book some years later in 1555, in which he gives some descriptions of the sea monsters that he illustrates on his map. So the passages I'm going to read now come from that book. He says, "The spouter or leviathan is 300 feet long. In order to destroy sailors, it often rises high above the yardarms of vessels and spurts forth the waves that is sucked into the tubes above its head. Sometimes it is not satisfied with doing mischief to a ship merely by showering water on it. It throws itself onto a ship's prow or stern and presses on it till the vessel sinks down and becomes submerged, or fiercely overturns it with its back or tail as if the craft were some small dish. Voyagers to India confirm the enormous size of these brutes and say that the sound of shouting and trumpets repels and disperses them." So if we look at the stern of that ship, we might at first think that was a gun that the man's holding, but it's actually a trumpet, and he's blowing the trumpet to try to scare away the sea monsters. So another case where it seems that humans have at least some ability to try to scare away sea monsters. This is a sea monster called the Ziphius, and the image shows it eating a seal while it itself is being nibbled on by another sea monster. And the text says the Ziphius has a ghastly head like that of an owl, a back that is tapering, or rather raised into the form of a sword, and a sharply pointed beak. And the image I showed at the beginning of the spectacular sea serpent, if you look very closely, see there are 2 men on the ship here and here, but he's also eating a man right here. And it says, the text says, a serpent of gigantic bulk, at least 200 feet long and 20 feet thick, frequents the cliffs and hollows of the seacoast near Bergen. It assaults ships, rearing itself on high like a pillar, seizes men and devours them. my colleague Luigi Diana has suggested that the sea monsters on this map were intended not only to impress the viewer, but also to dissuade fishermen from other countries from entering the Scandinavian waters. So if that suggestion is correct, there's at least in part an economic motivation for the presence of sea monsters on this map, namely to dissuade the fishermen from other nations coming into Scandinavian waters and thus leaving the bounty of the seas for Scandinavian fishermen. This is Gerard Mercator's terrestrial globe of 1541. I mentioned that the sea monsters on Olaus Magnus's map were very influential, and we're going to see that that's the case with this globe, which was made just 2 years after Olaus Magnus made his map. So here we have the whale on Gerard Mercator's globe, and we can see that it was certainly copied from Olaus Magnus's map made 2 years earlier. And here's another whale on the globe. And again, it was copied from Olaus Magnus's map. In this case, Mercator has removed the ship and reversed the image left to right, but the source of his inspiration really can't be doubted. So again, these were very influential sea monsters, those from Olaus Magnus's map. Moving on to another a map by the same cartographer, Gerard Mercator. Here's the Pacific on his world map of 1569. If we've heard the name Mercator, it's from the Mercator projection, which he debuted on this world map of 1569, and there are 13 sea monsters on it. And here in the Pacific, we see a whale south of Baja California, and he copied the whale from a scientific book about sea creatures by the Frenchman Pierre Ballon, which was published in 1553. And again, this is a case where we have a cartographer copying sea monsters from a work that he would have thought reliable. In the South Atlantic on Mercator's map, we have this elaborate sea serpent, which again was copied from Ballon's book, as we see here. Out in the South Pacific, we have Neptune riding a seahorse up here at the upper left. And we can see that Mercator has also copied this image from Ballon's book. In this case, Mercator has added Neptune to the back of the seahorse, but we can see that in other respects they're very similar. They both have the sort of curly-Q tails. So on his 1541 globe, Mercator used Olaus Magnus's 1539 map as his source, while on his 1569 map, he used Pierre Ballon's book of 1553. It seems that he wanted to use the most recent sources available for his sea monsters. And this, again, shows that a lot of sea monsters on maps are attempts, at least, to represent what actually existed in the oceans, even though at first glance they can seem very fantastic. On the other hand, there are some sea monsters that appear in maps, particularly from the middle of the 16th century forward, that are purely whimsical. They're not based on any illustrated encyclopedia or book about sea creatures or anything like that. So here we have one on Giovanni Francesco Camoccio's Cosmographia Universalis from 1569. One can look in contemporary and earlier books about sea creatures and not find anything like this sea monster. So this was invented by one cartographer or another, as we might guess from the sort of comical face with its tongue sticking out. And this points to a change in the function of sea monsters on maps. So they always had at least some decorative function, but also, as we've seen very often, cartographers were putting them on their maps because they found them in a book about sea creatures and believed that these things actually existed in the ocean. But when we transition to these whimsical sea monsters, their function becomes purely decorative. There's no longer a pretense that the cartographer is, or an attempt to depict something that lives in the ocean. Here's another whimsical sea monster, quite a haunting image of a sea monster consisting mostly of this horrified face. Sometimes it's difficult to know what to call these whimsical sea monsters. So this is maybe an aquatic pig dog. So some features of a dog, some features of a pig, and yet it's aquatic. We can see its webbed paws. This unusual humanoid sea monster from Urbano Monte's manuscript Atlas of 1590, with its terrifying long fingernails and red eyes. This spectacular whimsical image of early windsurfing on the back of a sea monster. I'll just point out that we can even see the shadow of the woman on the sail. It's really a very striking image, and there she is standing on the head of the sea monster. And of course, a good way to create a monster was to combine parts of a few different creatures. And that's what we have with this extravagant, whimsical sea monster. So it has the head of a bird and a fishy tail. And then we seem to have something like 5 elephant trunks, which are spouting like a whale would spout. So it's a very composite image. And again, this is not based on anything that the cartographer Mercator found in a book of sea creatures. This was invented. Moving towards the end of the 16th century, this is Jan de Wedicum's map of New France, which is to say Eastern Canada. And it's very interesting because it combines 2 different iconographical traditions of whales. So out on the ocean, we have these 2 images of whales that come from Olaus Magnus's map, the thick spouts. And at the bottom, we have this inset scene that also shows whales, but they're entirely different and much more realistic whales. So here's the inset scene. We have some whales that are grounded, that are being prepared as food by natives of Eastern Canada. And this was borrowed from this engraving. And the borrowing is easier to see if we reverse the engraving left to right. We can see that it's a very close copy of this engraving. So in this engraving, we have, if not perfectly realistic, at least much more realistic images of whales. And again, this map combines those 2 different iconographical traditions of whales. So the cartographer didn't know how to choose between them. Moving into the 17th century, we have another illustration of, in this case, St. Brendan on the back of a whale. So this goes back to the Physiologus and this story of sailors encountering what they think is an island, and it turns out to be a whale. In this case, it's St. Brendan, who is depicted as landing on the whale. St. Brendan was an Irish saint who was held to have visited many different islands in the Atlantic. So on the one hand, we have this survival of this myth that goes back to the 3rd or 4th century in this map from the early 17th century. At the same time, in these same years, in 1625, we have this map by Thomas Edge, which shows the island of Spitsbergen. It's labeled Greenland. That confusion was common at this time. It's really Spitsbergen, with whaling scenes. So there was an important whaling ground at Spitsbergen. So this map showed one where to go in order to catch whales, and then how to go about it. So if we look at those scenes, we first have the harpooning of the whale, the towing of the dead whale to the ship, the flensing of the whale, or the cutting of the blubber off of it, the landing and cutting up of the blubber, so bringing the blubber onto land, boiling, filtering, and barreling the blubber. And the cleaning and scraping of what are called the whale fins in the text above, which is baleen. And baleen could be used in hoop skirts, umbrellas, and various other products. So what we have here in Thomas Edge's map is the whale is no longer a monster here. Here the whale is purely an object of economic exploitation. So it's these two very different images in these two maps from just 4 years apart, I think point to an era of transition in the depiction of sea monsters on maps. And as the 17th century progressed, sea monsters, a bit sadly, became less and less common on maps. But rather than end on such a sad note, I'll end with a favorite, which is this scene from Nikolaos Sofianos's 1545 map of Greece, where we have this monster attacking a sailing vessel, and the soldiers on the vessel are using their spears to try and stab and push the sea monster away. And a little bit of levity is added to this otherwise dire scene by the very long and luxuriant eyelashes of the sea monster. So Lisa showed my book. Here it is again. I like to think that the book's a lot of fun to read and offers more avenues for investigation of this fun topic. And thank you very much.
That was amazing. Thank you. I know we have a couple questions that are in the chat box, and Josh is putting those together. Thank you for being with us tonight. I'm amazed when I go through your book about, we look at things now with a drone and modern technology, and some of these pictures are so accurate of the times of how the oceans, and it might not be to scale, but the way that the land forms, and it's amazing. It's amazing. So thank you for your extensive research. Thank you for all the illustrations that are included in the books and everything that you shared with us tonight. And remember, for those of you, put your questions in the chat box. If you're watching this on YouTube after it's recorded, put your questions in the comments. We follow those, we watch them, we'll get back to Chet, and we'll follow through with some answers for you. And I love being in the fantasy exhibit in front of these wonderful sea creatures made by modern day artists. So thank you. Josh, what are some of the questions we have?
All right, so one I had, we had a lot of obvious ocean creatures, sea monsters. Was there any notable ones that were particularly river monsters that you'd like to go over?
I'm trying to think of examples of river monsters that appear on medieval and Renaissance maps, and I'm not coming up with any. When you get into the 17th and 18th century, then I think there are a few, but I'm not coming up with any early examples, at least.
Okay. So some of these maps obviously get pretty old. What types of materials were some of the early maps on? Is there anything interesting as far as that goes?
Well, most of the really early ones are on parchment or vellum. So it's really a very, very thin, specially treated leather. And one consequence of that is they're very, very durable, much more so than paper. And they're also, they can be quite stiff. And I've had the experience of working with the maps in person. And when you unroll a vellum nautical chart, it's very stiff, and you actually have to fight it a bit to get it open. And then to keep it open, you have to put heavy weights on the corners. Okay. So it's a very distinct material from the paper maps that we're more used to.
Right. So have you come across any of these sea monsters depicted in the Great Lakes?
I know there are images of sea monsters depicted in the Great Lakes. I basically ended my book around 1600. And so I didn't go into the 17th and 18th century images of sea monsters.
I think he froze up for a minute.
Okay. The book basically ends around 1600 or a little bit thereafter. So I didn't go into the 17th and 18th century images and 19th century, if I recall correctly, images of sea monsters in the Great Lakes.
You sort of had to answer my next question, which was what was the newest map you'd seen that depicted sea monsters? So 19th century, boy?
Well, it's a good question. So there's actually a map that was made just a few years ago. I'm trying to remember, maybe 5 years ago, of the undersea cables, the network of undersea cables that go all around the world. And the makers of the map contacted me and asked me if they could include some of the sea monsters from my book on their map. And I didn't have the rights to the images, but as long as what they did is redraw the images, in which case they don't have to worry about the rights. So that very recent map and a map that treats of a very modern subject does have sea monsters on it.
So you might have covered this already, but how exactly did you fall into this subject? How did it fascinate you?
The images I showed of the sort of yellow background maps, which were of a manuscript of Ptolemy's geography at the National Library of Spain in Madrid. I went to that library to consult that manuscript and saw the sea monsters in that manuscript and realized what a great subject it was. And what I really started doing was writing an article about those sea monsters in that manuscript. But I realized that I had to give context to them, talk about earlier examples. So what it was originally intended to be an article kept getting longer and longer and longer. And finally, it turned into a book.
Okay. So obviously there's a lot of different types of sea monsters. I was curious, was there any notable patterns that you saw like over different time periods of what was focused on?
Yeah, to be candid, it's difficult to generalize. I mean, there's some sea monsters. Probably the most common sea monster to appear on maps is the siren. And there are other sea monsters that we think of as typical sea monsters that appear very infrequently on maps. So I think if we think about sea monsters, one of the ones that comes to mind is a giant octopus or giant squid. And we did see that one example from the Pizigani map of 1367 of the giant octopus pulling a man from ship. But that's the only case that comes to mind of a giant octopus depicted on a really early map. So there are some surprises in that direction. So some sea monsters that we think of as very typical actually are very infrequently represented on early maps.
Okay. I don't see any more questions at this time.
Okay, well, again, thank you. I'm looking through the chat. We have people and members everywhere from Maine to California, Colorado, as well as Michigan and Miami, the Florida Keys. We have a large community. So we appreciate the fact that we're doing this by Zoom. We are going to be starting in person again, but we will continue to have presentations or the presenter on Zoom so that we can capture the historical information and have it on our YouTube channel. Be sure to follow us and like our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on social media at Diving Museum and come visit us. We're open daily from 10 a.m. to 5 a.m. or excuse me, 5 p.m. Sorry, it's been a long day. Check us out at divingmuseum.org. Be sure to check out the wonderful Dive into Art Fantasy exhibit before it closes on April 30th. And we look forward to having our April speaker. We'll be talking about piracy in Key West. Fred Borch will be coming up. He's a military historian. So Chet, thank you for your time. As an Immerse self-presenter, we offer you a 1-year membership to the History of Diving Museum. So we hope that you can come down to the Florida Keys in person and take a break from Canada and New York and your various travels to come down here and visit us. We say don't drive by, dive in.
Thank you. I hope I can too.
All right, so with that, we're going to bid everyone a good evening and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.